What you're watching is the best bit of Iru. This is not meant as a sly dig or an insult, as I think it would be for many games, to call a simple section of walking the best bit. But Iru, whether intentionally or not, is at its most visceral, exciting and tense in these moments between its objectives. The disorienting nature of its early first-person perspective, matched with its oppressively short draw distance, not masked by any fog or visual trickery, and the droning, ever so out of place synth-led score that accompanies these otherwise silent moments, sells the player on the confusion, terror, and hence helplessness our protagonist must be feeling. Iru might be a horror game on the PS1, but it's definitely not a PS1 horror game. With over 20 years of horror game hindsight, Iru plays and presents itself closer to new wave internet horror games such as Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Slender: The 8 Pages, and even PT than its contemporaries in the horror genre like Resident Evil or Silent Hill. Iru was released in Japan on March 26, 1998, where it would stay for over 23 years. Its name only ever spoken in the West through the hushed whispers of the most hardcore of the hardcore horror game likers. It's not hard to understand why this oddity of late 90s Japanese game design experimentalism wasn't localized and marketed towards the far more attention deficit prone gamers of the West, who had, just 2 months previous, received the comparative action spectacle of Resident Evil 2, with all of its fully voice-acted trimmings and beautifully pre-rendered gravy. Iru was really blazing its own trails with its fully 3D environments and characters, and its defocusing of combat. Of course, horror games had already established puzzle solving as a tenet of the genre, but Iru's centering of its puzzles with the structure of classic Japanese adventure games and visual novels surrounding them was a bold leap into more quiet, considered and atmospheric game design. Now, over 20 years later, this oddity has become a curiosity amongst the circles who prefer to see the limitations of early 3D game design and presentation as an intentional aesthetic, and with the aforementioned proliferation of Iru's game style amongst more modern horror experiences, the appetite for something like Iru has never been stronger in the West. So it was really only a matter of time until a person, or group of persons dedicated enough, would emerge to finally translate Iru into English and remove it off the dusty shelf of forgotten Japan-only PlayStation games. So when in July of this year, the lovely people you're seeing the names of on screen released a fan-translated patch for the game, I decided to take the opportunity to dive into the relatively untapped waters of analysing this relic of horror games past. So Iru is not your typical PS1 survival horror affair. Everything from its camera perspective to its lack of combat or really any action puts the player in a much different headspace from the more bombastic experiences offered by its contemporaries. Iru's first hour conveys a sense of unease that was seldom seen on such early 3D hardware. This is due in large part to its camera perspective and movement controls. You see, Iru was released before the wide proliferation of two-stick first-person controls, and less than 2 years after the release of the PlayStation's twin-stick controller, the DualShock. So, Iru had to bind both character and camera movement to the D-pad. Left and right turn the camera respectively, up and down moves the player character forward or back, and strafing is bound to the left and right bumpers. For a modern player, these controls obviously take a moment to get to grips with, but I'm not fully convinced players at the time had much more luck with learning these controls either, as it really isn't the most intuitive setup. But what this control system and perspective does is limit the player's ability to be fully aware of their surroundings. In horror games of its time, such as Resident Evil, the fixed and often wide camera angles allow the player full spatial awareness for most of their playtime. Of course, scares were still manufactured by hiding horrors just out of frame, but Iru's relinquishing of its camera controls back to the player allows for more organic and player-led moments of horror to occur, And the fact that most players will be wrestling with the controls means that the tension built in anticipation of what might just be a head swivel away is greater than many other games of its time. Iru even uses this lack of spatial awareness to its advantage, hitting the player with a few genuinely shocking jump scares early on as to warn against getting too comfortable. Janky controls aren't the only limitation of its hardware, keeping players on the edge and in the dark within Iru. Short draw distances were not only a staple of early 3D games, but also a necessity. Unlike the game that would more famously use its short draw distances as a mood setter less than a year later, Silent Hill, Iru chooses not to contextualize nor abstract this hardware limitation with fog or any other narrative explanation. Instead, it simply presents the player with a never-ending void of black, just a few steps from wherever they happen to be standing, and slowly, chunk by chunk, draws out the next pieces of geometry as the player lumbers into the void. These two aspects of its game design, whether intentional or not, end up as Iru's most interesting features, and often feel as though they're daring the player to face the unknown with every passing moment of gameplay. With all of this, it's not a pain for me to say that Iru excels in creating a sense of uncertainty and helplessness within players, but as one gets further into the experiences, it becomes clear that this near Lynchian level of unease was not the intention of the developers. Well, not entirely at least. Notice how thus far in this video, I've only been referring to Iru's first hour or so. Well, there is a reason for that. When the player is first thrown into Iru, they quite obviously have little to go off context-wise, which of course is a large contributor to the sense of unease I've been focusing on thus far. But as the developers start to show their cards to the player, this eeriness very quickly begins to shatter. There's a concept within horror media that says that the less one shows of the horror, the scarier it becomes. This is probably due to the fact that the audience's imagination can come up with images far more terrifying than the piece of media they're consuming. Think of the original Jaws and how little the shark is actually shown on screen, but how scary it is nonetheless. As one begins to play Iru, this phenomenon is exploited immensely. But as the game goes on, it's clear this was not the intention of the developers. Because by Iru's 2-hour mark, it has displayed its horrors in the starkest light possible. With a single cutscene, the atmosphere of Iru goes from an eerie, nail-biting exercise in restraint and implication to a slapstick, near-satirical tone, simply by revealing to the player what they should be afraid of. Suffice it to say though, it's pretty hard to be scared of this. From this moment, a player must shift their expectations of what Iru is, and let go of the notions imparted on them by its opening hours. All of this isn't to say that Iru's more silly side doesn't have its merits, just that the tonal whiplash resulting from this shift may take a moment for some players to recover from, and may turn others away completely. Now that we've covered Iru aesthetically, you're probably wondering how it actually plays. Well, Iru's most stark similarities to its contemporaries can be found in its gameplay. Like Resident Evil, the player's progression is locked behind obtuse puzzles that usually involve keys or other such items that need to be combined or used in specific locations. Unlike Resident Evil, however, Iru forgoes combat for sequences in which the player is chased by a monster, and their only chance of survival lies in finding a specific spot to hide in before said monster catches up to them. These sequences inject some much needed urgency into the otherwise slow and methodical gameplay the rest of Iru provides. Outside of the puzzles and chase sequences, the player will spend their time wandering the hallways of the school that the entire game takes place within, looking for the next person to talk to as to progress the story. Unfortunately, however, it's very rarely made clear to the player where or who the character with the next piece of story progressing dialogue is. So, Unless a guide or walkthrough is being used, expect to be wandering around aimlessly, entering every room trying to find where to go next. And when in these moments of confusion, the aforepraised obtuseness and slow speed of the movement system becomes an annoyance unmatched by anything else the game throws at the player. Once the player has traversed Iru's tonal whiplash and gameplay obtuseness, the story there presented is quite the engaging one, despite its overwhelming schlockiness. The school Iru employs as its setting slowly morphs from the average Japanese high school to a den of the occult, and the characters that inhabit it similarly go through a transformation from normality to theatric peculiarity in a way that feels earned within the story. The dialogue throughout the experience is extremely well written, revealing just enough to keep the player engaged without completely laying out what is going on at any given time. And the characters seem to react realistically to the predicaments they're thrown into. Obviously, it's hard to tell how much of this is due to the localization and how much is simply the original writing. But on that note, the fan translation effort for this game is absolutely flawless. At no point did I feel an incongruency between what I was playing and what I was reading. It all felt extremely authentic to the original vision of the game, and I didn't encounter any bugs or issues within the translation or writing my entire playthrough. I really do have to lump the highest praise possible onto the incredible team that devoted their time to bringing this gem to a new audience. So, Iru is a strange one to say the least, bucking the trends of its time to make something that might not have been appreciated until decades later, whether that's because modern developers saw the potential in its forgotten ideas or just a shifting of trends towards it. Despite my shock at the tonal swipe it makes after its opening, I enjoyed Iru for what it was, but also what it represents, a gem from a long gone time and an excellent example of the resurrecting power of fan devotion. If you can, I definitely recommend checking out Iru, if only as a history lesson or to support the incredible people who brought it to the West free of charge.